welcome back to the Backside Ground Balls podcast. My name is Trevor Powers, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host of this podcast, Dan Galati. Dan, we have a super special guest today. We have John DeRouin, the Director of Pitching Performance and Strategy at the University of Arizona. First off, John, thank you for letting Dan and I come out to Tucson, and Michael and Cal and all of us, the crew, and coming out to Tucson and being able to tour the facilities. It was an awesome experience, but we're really happy to have you on here to kind of talk a little bit more in detail today.
For sure. First, I appreciate you guys having me on here today. And it was great. I mean, it's awesome to have people who are passionate about highlighting programs and what they do, in a player development lens. And it was cool to be able to talk about a lot of the new systems we have installed at Arizona, showcase our facilities and kind of the history of the program. So, and it was cool to see that come together in the videos that you guys put together. So that was great. And, we're really glad you guys could come out and see everything that we have going there.
Yeah, definitely. It was an awesome experience. And I know it's a long trip away from here in North Carolina, but I have full intention to hopefully get out there for maybe a super regional in the 2025. But the first question I kind of want to ask for you is, yeah, definitely. The first question I want to ask for you is recently, just based off of your social media posts, it seems like a couple high-level arms have been in Tucson to get some work in, and Tariq Skubal and Tristan McKenzie. So talk a little bit about not necessarily how those guys kind of came to getting on campus, but what makes those guys different? Because a lot of baseball fans look at guys like Skubal and McKenzie, and you see those guys in the big leagues, and it's like those guys feel like unicorns, I guess.
Yeah, I think the cool thing now with just like building the infrastructure that we have, with our lab is, like we'll get guys that on the pro side that will want to come in and sit down with us and just like get a comprehensive biomechanical breakdown, just be in a place where there's maybe not the attention of social media from being in a facility. And, they can just come and have a place where they can talk freely about how they feel their season went. They can get information from us that's, unbiased. And I think that's cool. It's cool for our players when these guys come in, whether it's a guy that, just got drafted last year or, a guy that's accrued a lot of service time in the big leagues. I think it's really cool for our guys to see how they go about their business and also hear them talk. Because I think one thing, when you get to professional baseball, right, like you have different coaches, you have coordinators, right? You have leadership front office, right? So there's a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds. So you're going to get a lot of information. And I think, we talk about this with our guys, it's developing your own identity, right? Who are you? And for us on the college side, like the education piece around that is important, teaching our guys who they are, right? It's like, if you're going to build a culture as a team, it first starts with getting guys to understand who they are as individuals. What's my role in this operation, of our organization? And Skubal, he's a guy that I knew from when I was with the Tigers. He came down and was gracious enough to talk to our team the other day, and, just unscripted, like we didn't give him any prompts, but just touched on so many important things, both like, on the mental side, on the physical side, on team dynamics, like, so many things that are important, not just in college, but skills that carry you through, to the level that he's at of being, the Cy Young Award winner, probably unanimously in the American League this year, Triple Crown winner, right? So I think that's it's cool for our guys to see these guys who operate at the highest level and just how they process information. But then, and a question I posed to school the other day was like, we obviously live in a world where we're presented with so much objective information. How do you take that and leverage it? But also, how do you know when to, flip the switch into competition mode and understand like what works for you? And he gave such a good answer of like, my 4 days in between my start, I'm trying to collect as much information as I can, whether that's like there was a regression in a pitch shape that I need to adjust in my pre-start pen, right? Or like understanding the opposing lineup I'm about to face and making sure I have a good understanding of each guy. We've come up with a good game plan. But for me, like when I get on the mound and I'm pitching, it's, one pitch at a time, being convicted in every pitch, no matter the result, and just sticking to that process, right? And not worrying about anything else, right? Like he's like, my cues are solely external when, I'm on the mound every fifth day. So I think that's important for our guys, is like, in an information age, understanding the balance, right? We need the information to make us better, but also we need to, be able to channel, right, our inner competitive edge when the lights come on. So it's cool when these guys are around to just like hear how they operate, hear how, how they manage games, right? How they deal with the highs and the lows. So it's great when those guys come around. It's good for our guys. It's, it's nice. It's nice for them to hear how they go about their business.
So and it's not only you had two big leaguers there, which is awesome in its own right, but Scooble for a second, you had the best big leaguer there. Like the guy
Yeah.
might be the best pitcher on the planet currently.
Mm-hmm.
From a outside of a mindset thing, from a physical sense, whether it's a pitch or mechanically how well he can adjust, what surprised you? Because you've been around a lot of high level pitchers. So when you watch him work and you see him throw, what kind of surprises you about him and what he can do and what he's able to do? Is there anything that's like, man, that's crazy?
Yeah, I think the first piece is the physicality, right? Of just, when you look at him, and you look at a lot of these guys and too, it's like, and it's funny having Mackenzie here the other day and then him the day after, like two different ends of the spectrum of physical built. But when you look at someone like Scooble, right, like the first thing that stands out is the physicality. And I think we talk about stuff a lot, right? Like, and he obviously has high level stuff. I mean, he throws two different fastball shapes. It's a really good changeup. It's a hard slider. He controls the count, right? Like he limits damage, limits free 90s, right? Like he does everything that you look for in a frontline major league starting pitcher. And I think like when you look at somebody like him, right, who's doing it at the highest level, there's a lot of commonalities, right? Like there's the stuff, there's the physicality, there's the ability to execute pitches at a high level, right? And I think that's what that's what it takes, right? Like if you're going to pitch at a high level in the big leagues, right, and be the best pitcher on the planet, like it requires having all of those things. So I think that's the, when you have a guy like that who, I was fortunate to just spend a little bit of time around him when I was with the Tigers, and I said this to our guys when he was going through his rehab in 23, before he came back, after, the start of the second half, like how that guy went about his work on a day in February in spring training when he was months away from pitching is probably how he still goes about his work, when he's preparing for a start every 5 days and he's, in contention for winning the Cy Young, and, he was in this race to win the Triple Crown, right? So like how you do anything, is how you do everything. And that should be the mindset of a lot of guys, is like, how you go about your work in February on the backfields of spring training when you're rehabbing, that's how you go about your work when, things are going great too. It shouldn't be like, hey, I'm going to take it easy today because I'm still a long ways away. And I think the diligence is what makes somebody like himself the best pitcher on planet Earth, because it hasn't always been easy for a guy like that. I mean, he had Tommy John in college, he ended up being a ninth round. It wasn't a high round pick, right? Had to work his way up to the big leagues, was not labeled this premier prospect, didn't generate a huge signing bonus. And so a guy like that is the epitome of like having talent, having these physical gifts, but also like, having the ability to say, hey, this is who I am. This is my identity, right? And like working his way to the big leagues, right? Not it just being like, oh, he's a first rounder. He's always been talented and gifted. Like he had one college offer from Seattle University. That was the only place he could go play Division I baseball, and has truly developed himself into being what he is. So I think for a guy like that, like it's kind of this three-headed monster, of physicality stuff. The elite a mental approach, the ability to have consistency in a routine and process, and just be rooted in who he is as a human being, right? Like I think that's a lot of it too, is like guys like that are really confident in who they are, right? Like they have a self-identity, and that's important.
Let's talk about then the guys that you're working with, or we were talking before. They're 19 years old, so they're still kids, right? They're college kids, so they have, there's a lot you have to do to build them. right? And that's your job, is you're trying to build them. How do you go about balancing, right? Because stuff is obviously premier stuff is like everybody is after stuff today. And we have a million different ways to get to that answer. But then you talk about what makes Scooble special in the fact that he has the mental. How do you go about balancing the competing guys with the we're developing stuff here and we do want to be, player development driven and you know, feeding guys information. I know we talked about this a little bit when I was down there, but it always fascinates me because I think it's a tough balance and it's something you really have to be able to do in order to have a successful pitching staff.
Yeah, for sure. No, and I think that's the hardest piece where the game is at right now, especially at the amateur level, right? Because even prior to them getting here in college, the landscape has changed a lot just in terms of amateur baseball now and the showcase world and guys going to play for teams and maybe only pitching a couple innings and then, flying out and showing up to the next tournament. So I think it's changed in the sense where like, guys maybe aren't necessarily quote unquote competing at the same level, but I don't think that's a hindrance necessarily. Is it definitely maybe a little bit of a roadblock in certain instances? Yeah, but I also think like kids still have a competitive nature to them, and it's our job when they get here to not only provide them the resources to develop skills, right, that are going to be successful on the mound, physical skills, but also to like put them in situations where we are challenging them. And that starts for us like as a program with like quantifying a lot, right? Like what do we value? What are our big rocks, right? As a pitching staff, right? Like our pitching staff is our own organization, right? Like so we need to have like pillars of what we value. And so for us, like we're constantly trying to develop the individual, right? Because that's important. If we're going to have success as a team, if we're going to get everyone rowing in the same direction, then everyone has to know what their role is in doing that, and who they are. But also, like we have to build this team, this group culture, this organizational culture and identity. And like so we'll track throughout the entirety, especially this fall, is like how many times did you get to 0-2-1-2 in an outing, right? Like, and we attach points to these categories. It's like, so we have two columns, like a green column of things that you did well, getting to 0-2-1-2, not giving up a free 90. You get points for punching a guy out. And then we have a red column where it's like, if you walk a guy, you lose a point, right? If you give up hits, you lose a point, right? Like, if you gave up a couple of runs, your points drop. So, and that gets posted. So, our guys are seeing how they're progressing. Am I doing the things in terms of game management that are going to allow me to be successful, right? And if a guy is struggling in a certain area, now we have something to work off of, right? It's like, okay, you got to 0-2-1-2 on this guy, but then you walked him, right? Like, why did that maybe happen? How do we go back to like, giving a guy a better understanding of what his pre-pitch process needs to look like, right? Like, does he have good external cues, right? All these things matter. And if we're tracking it, then we're building competition naturally because no one wants to lose, right? Like if your name is at the bottom of that list, you're going to be like, well, crap, I got to figure out how to get myself to the top of this list, right? And if a guy is at the top of that list, then we know something's working, right? And we need to expand upon that and make sure they're bought into that, right? So I think it gives us the ability. Like you can't manage what you're not measuring, and if we're trying to build a culture of competitiveness, then we need to track stuff and we need to hold guys accountable to stuff. And that's where I think for us, like we're constantly tracking things and giving guys objective information to be like, hey, this week was really good. This week wasn't good. What were you thinking? What was your pre-pitch process? What were some things that you thought when things were going well? Some things you were thinking when things weren't going well? And it gives us a point to kind of iterate off of, and help guys find a process that works for them. So when you're talking about building kind of a competitive edge and like, integrating competition into your culture, it starts with just tracking things and giving guys things to work towards, and having them compete with their peers pretty much every single week.
You speak about competing with your peers each and every week, and one of the things that I'd seen on social media. Dan had sent it to me, I believe, was just competition bullpens and creating that environment and that culture of competition. Talk about the value of integrating that into when guys get on that rubber and have to get out there and competing against the guy next to them, so they can kind of almost train that in a real execution setting as well.
Yeah, so I think it's funny because when you look at like bullpen structure, right? Like I think it's so easy to get caught up into this rigid model of just like this blocked practice, right? Like you have your different types of practice design, and blocked practice is pretty much like you're working towards a goal, right? And like your blocked practice could be, you're working on something with delivery, you're working on something in terms of pitch design, but at the end of the day, like sometimes we have to kind of remove some of those guardrails and create like a more representative practice space where guys are competing against each other. And like we'll do our competition bullpens kind of as the last week before we go into our team phase and we start scrimmaging. And the goal in that, right, is like to try and simulate what the game is going to provide, right? And the game is variable. You're probably not going to throw 6 fastballs in a row, right? Like there's probably going to be a couple off speed pitches in between, right? And you got to be able to adjust and execute. So for us, when we do this, we try and pair guys who have similar arsenals. And then the whole thing, Kevin has his own script, right? So he's following a script, but to the guys, it's completely random, right? Like it could be, 0-0 breaking ball for a strike, right? And what we talk about as a group, is our pitch margins, right? Where does your stuff play? These are the areas that each pitch shape that you throw is going to best perform in. So we're not like, an 0-0 slider for a strike. It does. We don't have to be throwing to this extremely small area, right? We talk about we have big areas that we can have success in. So our guys understand that you're trying to execute to your margins. And then there's a point system attached. So if you execute that pitch, you get X number of points. And all the guys are around, it gets loud, it gets competitive. So you're providing affordances that the game, ends up giving you, and our guys have to manage that. And sometimes like we joke that I feel like it's almost harder to manage that when all your buddies are screaming in your ear right on top of you on the mound. And like, when you're pitching in a game and like people, there's a lot of people, but they're far away from you, and you can kind of lock yourself in a little bit more than when all your buddies are yelling at you and they're right on top of you on the mound. So that's the cool part, is like it's variable, right? So like obviously the game is variable. You're going to have to be able to throw a fastball on the inner half and then be able to execute a slider right after that. There's pressure because you're competing with a guy next to you, just like you're competing with the other team that you're pitching against, right? So like that, and then also just like I said, having all those guys on top of you, kind of yelling you at screaming, you have to be able to be rooted in your process. What's my pre-pitch process? How do I slow the moment down to be able to execute over the plate? So I think that's where it's cool. It's fun. It allows us to change our practice a little bit, and like I said, give our guys a space where we're reflecting more of what the game's going to provide. And that makes it fun. It gives our guys a chance to compete, outside of just like being on the mound in an inner squad or whatever that may be.
Yeah, keeping things fresh for guys is always maybe a challenge, but always you feel like you always reap the benefits from it. You said something in there about kind of understanding where guys' stuff plays, right? Because every guy is unique and their stuff is unique, and how they move is everybody's different, obviously. How do you guys go about leveraging that, the uniqueness of guys? How do you go about getting that information and then understanding where guys are successful with their stuff? Because there isn't, that's one of the other fun things about pitching, is there isn't one roadmap that you can follow at all for any of it. So how do you guys go about, okay, this is where this guy kind of has success. This is where his stuff will play against, the way the offenses are in college baseball nowadays. It's certainly a challenge.
Yeah, I think it's twofold for us, right? And I'll break it down just in the sense of the fall, and then kind of how we go about that process in the spring. So the fall obviously is like, it's huge for us developmentally, right? Like this is where we're really gaining context into each guy that we have, right? And that starts at the beginning with our physical assessment, right? Understanding like starting conditions of a guy physically. Who is he, right? Just away from even throwing a baseball. That's the first piece is like we'll go through our movement assessment and just start there, right? And then from there we move to our lab, and then we're gonna look at things objectively, and we're gonna tie in the data that we're collecting in terms of biomech data on the kinematic side, right, with Kinetrax, and then the data we're collecting off the Newt force mount and getting ground reaction forces, and then we're gonna tie that into the physical structure, right? Like, and I say this a lot: structure will always dictate function, right? So who they are in that physical assessment is going to give you a pretty good idea of like how they're going to want to move and organize when we get them on the mound. And then we could start to validate some things when they get on the mound to say like, okay, these are some strengths, these are some areas for improvement. But it's you're starting to build, the way I describe it is like you're building their fingerprint, right? Each guy is going to have their own unique fingerprint, so we're trying to collect as much information so we can best build that fingerprint. So it starts with the physical assessment, then it moves to the mound. And then, while we're doing that, like we're getting edgertronic footage, we're understanding hand to ball interaction, we're building a Rolodex of current grips, current pitch shapes. And then we can decide like, okay, well, what are our margins for improvement? What is the best path forward? And for each guy, it could be a little bit different, right? Like I think for most guys at this level specifically, you're trying to build a plan and program centered around what's going to allow them to move consistently, right? There's no such thing as repeatability. Everyone talks about that. Like, no two throws are the same, right? But we're trying to, it's repetition, without repetition, right? Like there's this whole kind of analogy of, back in World War II, the Russians were studying, like how to be efficient in manufacturing. And they were looking at guys and how they were like hammering whatever it was. And the best guys were not necessarily the ones that did it the most, didn't have the most consistent path back, but they struck it the most consistent, right? So that's what we're trying to build, right? Is like, we're trying to build consistency, right? We know there's no such thing as repeatability, right? But that's what we're trying to do is we're trying to put our guys in a situation where like, we know we can have consistency and movement quality. So it starts there, right? And then once we do that, now we can start attacking stuff, right? If we know we're moving efficiently in accordance with what our body wants to do, now we can start attacking stuff and shapes. And then, that's our fall really, is like building arsenals, testing it in games. And because the fall for us is like, that's where we can test stuff. And then we're always tracking things so we can see how each shape performs against lefty versus righty. What's going to be our best 2-strike option? What pitch can we steal the most strikes with in certain counts? So that's like the fall for us. And then as we transition to the spring, that's huge, is like, if when Kevin's calling a game, he's calling more to the pitcher's strength and the hitter weakness. We have an understanding of the hitters, what their weaknesses are. We build our scouting report, but at the end of the day, we're trying to play to our guys' strengths. And we'll go in and we'll track, each week, okay, how's this shape performing to righties versus lefties? Does this pitch take on more damage versus righties than it does against lefties? What pitches do we have some clear margins to be able to steal strikes with early in count? What's our best put away option? So we're building all this information, and then we're targeting now, okay, what's our best usage strategy? So we'll build that out each week, and that could adjust. It's like, maybe we need to pare back fastball usage to left-handed hitters, or maybe we need to up slider usage to right-handed hitters. So then we can adjust and we can start pitching to our guys' strengths. Then the information is telling us what hitters like and don't like, right? So we can tie those two worlds together, and that ultimately, I think, allows our guys to be successful over a large portion of the year, is because it starts with everything we're doing in the fall, and then we're tracking that all the way through the spring. And again, we're trying to get guys to be the best version of themselves. That's what matters all the time, right? Is like, it starts from day one of the fall and it carries all the way through the spring. And like I said, that assessment on day one matters. It matters in January, it matters in March, it matters in June. Because ultimately, like I said, we're trying to get guys to be the best version of themselves. And if we have a comprehensive understanding of that, then we're going to be in a pretty good spot to make the best decisions possible.
When you start talking about understanding how guys move and then kind of breaking into developing the stuff off of that, is it more is it more looking at arm angle? Is arm angle more important when we start talking about stuff, or is it kind of the whole picture of like, does the lower half play into that as well? Like, is because we talk about extension a lot right now,
Mhm.
especially with fastballs and especially at the big league level, right? So, guys with a ton of extension, a lot of times they can create the ride. I'm thinking of Zach Wheeler and Spencer Strider. So I'm wondering, is it more about the lower half and how much extension we're getting down the mound? Or is it more about arm angle and one extension with arm angle, but also kind of release height? What are you guys looking at when you think about, okay, now we're kind of diving into stuff and we need to start developing that and tying it into how they move?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think it's both, right? Like I think for us, it's stuff is not just the shape, right? It's like you just said, a guy could have a lead extension, and a relatively low release height, but say maybe his raw induced vertical break isn't as high, right? But he's got, he throws from a low launch with big extension, and his vertical approach angle, is say, flatter than average, right? So we know like that fastball could have impact at the top of the zone, even though it's not 20 inches of carry, right? So I think that's where it's figuring out where each guy is unique. So we talk a lot about slots, right? Like different release heights. I mean, we have guys probably, on this pitching staff specifically that cover almost all ends of the spectrum. So I think it's understanding what makes a guy unique, right? And like I said, and that could be in release qualities, that could be in pitch shapes, right? And we talk a lot about like pronation, supination bias, and how that's going to impact the shapes that you can throw. And we're trying to, the way I describe it is like, you want to have arsenal and delivery synergy, right? So like you want the arsenal that you're creating to work in accordance with how you're moving. So when we're designing arsenals and building out shapes, we're trying to work within physical bandwidth, right? What can a guy actually do, right? Because that's like not every guy can pronate through a changeup. So us knowing that, hey, we have a guy who's a vertical slot supinator, right? Let's just say he throws from a higher release height and throws from this more vertical slot, and he has a more supination bias. So he's going to approach more to the side of the ball, right? Like we know that guy can't get through a changeup, but there's options to create depth, and that's when you can get into leveraging seam shifted wake and unique ball physics to create the shapes that you want. So building arsenals, building stuff, again, it goes back to that assessment of understanding who you're dealing with, right? What type of mover are they? What is their body physically going to allow them to do? And then, that's how we build out stuff is like, we don't just look at it in a vacuum of like, hey, every guy should be doing X, Y, and Z. Every guy's going to be a little bit different in terms of what they can and can't do. And it's trying to leverage their superpowers. So that's where I think, going back to the stuff thing, it's threefold, right? Do we have unique shapes? Do we have unique release heights? Is there, a guy who, again, like we have some guys that have big extension, low launch, right? Like, and we have, good carry, right? And that's where it's like, okay, he's got a fastball that's super impactful. So it's really gaining the full picture. And then from there, that's when we can start to give guys an understanding of their margins and where their stuff is going to best play. So, first it's kind of building it out and then getting guys to understand now, hey, once we have all these tools in the toolbox that you can use, this is where they're best going to work in these scenarios. So that's where, for us, it's like we're trying to find value in unique ways, and there's a multitude of ways to get there. So it's just trying to figure out, hey, like I said, what's the best version of this guy going to look like, and how are we going to go about getting there? And once we get there, then educating the player on who he is.
I'm fascinated by your perspective on this specifically based on your experience in the private sector, but how do you then translate it to how hitters react to it, right? So obviously we can get this, quantifiable, this is elite stuff, whether it's a stuff plus metric, whether it's what the Rapsodo, TrackMan, whatever the data is saying, but then for some reason it's not translating to the hitters, right? It's not, hitters aren't struggling to hit it. So how do you work through that, especially as a guy who has been, in the more private sectors, more lab based and more, hey, let's build this stuff up. And then maybe when those guys get on the mound, it doesn't translate exactly. And how do you kind of work through that process of seeing guys that they check all the boxes in the stuff department, but then you look and they're giving up long fly balls and some homers and some hard contact, and it's just not adding up in your head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely interesting because there are definitely cases like that, where you see a large majority of the boxes being checked, but when you look at performance, you're like, well, why does this guy have a 420 expected WOBA on his fastball when it's like, the shape on it is actually like, he's got pretty good sink, and like there's certain elements where you're like, that doesn't really add up. But that's where you have to pull back the layers, right? And I think we talk about stuff, right? Stuff is important. Execution matters a ton. And I think when you start getting to this level, like, hitters will exploit you for making mistakes. So I think that's one piece too. It's like, usually when we see guys that have pretty good stuff, and it's like, well, it doesn't really add up in terms of why they're taking on damage. When we look at like True Media, we'll look at heat maps, right? And we can start to, look at like pitch frequency, right? That's just a simple one where you can track over time. Like, we had a case with one of our guys last year where as the year progressed, he started taking on more damage on his changeup. And when we looked at it, it's like it lit up red on the bottom left part of that heat map when the left-handed pitcher lit up red on the bottom left part of that heat map when he was, pitching really well. And then when we started to see some regression in performance, that red started to shift more towards the heart of the plate, right? So like, that's a simple way, one, where you're just like, is it an execution problem, right? Or do we have good stuff, but we're not just executing it to the areas we know that pitch is going to be the most successful? And sometimes that's on us as coaches too, right? Or like, again, are we using a pitch in a situation that like it's not going to perform? Are we setting this guy up for failure, right, by using a pitch that really doesn't make sense to righties or lefties, or in this count, right? Like, that's a huge piece for us, is like, there's a self-evaluation that we need to do as coaches to make sure that we're leveraging the right pitches in the right spots. So that's one. And I think two, to go back to like the player specific side of this, at the major league level, teams have figured out how to start to quantify this. And I know certain organizations are leveraging it more than others, but that's deception, visual deception, right? And I think, and you can look at it loosely at the college level, just looking at release qualities, right? Like, is this guy low extension, average release height, where like, the shape in a vacuum may look good, but it plays down just due to, like I said, some vanilla release qualities that this guy presents, right? But I think, getting on a more granular level, a lot of orgs are quantifying deliveries and how deceptive they are. And I think we can get there through biomech data at the collegiate level. I think that's something that I know here at Arizona we want to ultimately get to, and it's something that we're looking at a little bit. Probably definitely not to the level of what analysts are doing on the biomech side at the major league level, but I think there's things where visual deception is definitely real. I think hitters struggle if a guy occludes the ball from the hitter's view for a long time, and then they're picking it up really late. So I think there's a lot of different things that can go into it on that sense, where deception is definitely real. Obviously we haven't really publicly quantified it yet, where the general public has an idea of what that looks like. But I do think, it's almost twofold in that sense, where it's like, if a guy's taking on more damage, is it a pitch calling execution issue? Are we not using it in the right spots? Is this guy not throwing it in the right areas? Or are there just certain things that a hitter likes in this guy's delivery that he feels he can see for an extended period of time? And, that's why this guy is struggling. So, I think it's interesting. Like, there's a lot to dive into with that, for sure.
What then are some of the traits that you're finding to be most successful in? Because Trevor and I have been talking for a while now about kind of developing stuff that has two plane break, right? So
Mm-hmm.
instead of just in the fastball that's riding to the top of the zone, creating something that can ride potentially and cut, or sink is down and getting run, and then it, yeah. So just what are some of the qualities then that you're finding? Some of the characteristics of these pitches and the stuff that guys are having the most success with and hitters are having the most trouble with.
Yeah, for sure. Um, I think what we saw, like to just kind of stay on theme with like the collegiate level specifically, I think what we saw last year in terms of just our weekend rotation um, is if you have the ability to execute three average to above average pitches, four strikes, then you're giving yourself the best possibility to succeed. If you can add a fourth pitch in there, then you're in a really good spot at the collegiate level. Um, so I think that's like at this level, when you can throw 3 to 4 as a starting pitcher, right? If you can throw 3 to 4 really, really good pitches for strikes, or say average to a slightly above average pitches for strikes, then you're putting yourself in a really good position because it's hard to game plan as a collegiate hitter for a guy that can throw, sliders and 2-0 counts and steal strikes with it, right? Or can throw a curveball behind and count and steal strikes, or has a multitude of options in 2-strike counts that he can get a swing and miss or off barrel contact on. So I think just starting there, right? Like, can we build a dynamic arsenal? And I think this is where the game's going at the major league level too, in terms of starting pitching. You see it in the postseason right now. It's like Walker Buehler's arsenal now in 2024 is drastically different than what Walker Buehler's arsenal was, say, pre TJ, pre second Tommy John, say even back to like 2020, 2021, right? Where it's like guys are adding sinkers, right? They're throwing two different fastball variations, right? They have, multiple breaking ball options. So I think you're seeing the game start to shift back to like almost what it was, right? The paradigm is almost kind of shifted back a little bit more towards like, guys having more dynamic arsenals to give them more options to be able to use to control platoon splits against left-handed hitters and right-handed hitters. And I think that still holds true at the collegiate level too. So when we're talking about having an impactful starting pitcher, right? Like we need a guy and I mean, you could throw sinker, you can throw four seam, right? Like I don't think the fastball profile, I don't think you need to be pigeonholed necessarily at this level into like, oh, you can only start if you throw a fastball that's got, 17, 18 plus inches of carry, right? But I think because there's plenty of guys that are, have more east-west arsenals that are successful starting pitchers at the collegiate level too. But I think what I saw, across the board this year amongst like the best starting pitchers that we faced is they could execute three, average to slightly above average pitches for strikes. And if they had a fourth, forget about it. So, your relievers, it's different, right? Like, there are guys that are going to have two really good pitches that throw hard, that can get away with that and can get you 3 to 6 outs. So I think it varies, right? It varies on the role, what you're trying to get out of guys. And again, it just goes back to like what we talked about prior was like, if you give guys a really comprehensive understanding of who they are and where their stuff best plays, you're giving yourself an advantage because those guys are taking the rubber, being convicted in who they are, and how they're going to best attack hitters. And that's what's fun for us is, like I said, providing our guys with that understanding. So yeah, it's definitely interesting. I think, pro ball and college definitely run parallels in certain ways, but are definitely different in others. But I definitely think that holds true where it's like, if you can throw 3 to 4 pitches, 4 strikes in any count, then you're going to give yourself a pretty good competitive advantage.
You touched on something there that I want to highlight because it's something that I've been kind of chewing on since the spring there, and that's the multiple fastballs, right? Because velocity creates obviously more room for error for a pitcher. The harder you can throw, right, the more room for error you have. You can miss a little bit more because you can still have the ability to beat bats. Now, adding in a second fastball one, have you guys toyed with that at all? And can you kind of speak on how much more that can help you out? Because now you can have a fastball that has one shape and another one that does another, and they're both firm, and how much more of an advantage that gives you over a hitter.
Yeah, I definitely, it's something that we want to try and do here. It's a little more challenging. There's a lot of ideas that never make it out of the idea box in college, just because you bring yourself back down to reality and you realize like they're 18, 19 to 22, 23-year-old kids, right? So like there's a lot of things that in theory make sense, but in actuality you're probably pushing the envelope in terms of getting it done. But I do think that it's definitely an advantage if you can throw to that point, right? Of like, you're dealing with two pitches, right, that are going to probably be in the same velocity range, but are going to have drastically different movement profiles, right? So again, right, I think the strikeout is the most undefeated strategy, right? We're constantly trying to chase swing and miss because we know we're eliminating the defense majority of the time when a swing and miss happens, unless we get to a drop third strike or whatever. But the swing and miss is the most undefeated strategy. That's what we're chasing. But at the end of the day, like we're also chasing weak contact. We're trying to limit damage. So it's why numbers like, WOBA, expected WOBA, ISO, expected ISO, like are so important when evaluating a pitch's performance, because you're gaining more context into the batted ball events, right? So that's where two different fastball variations can be huge, especially like when you're talking about facing a same-sided hitter, is if I can throw a pitch that's moving into a right-handed hitter that I know there's a high likelihood that this pitch isn't going to take on a lot of damage, like that's the game that I'm going to try and play, right? Like, yes, I'm chasing the swing and miss, but I'm also chasing weak contact. So I rather not run the risk of there being a positive batted ball outcome, when I can have two different shapes that one, this guy's going to contend with, and two, I know this sinker is probably going to, or two seam, whatever, is going to fare better to a same sided hitter, and I can control those platoon splits a little bit better. So now you give yourself more options, right? And I think that's where it's so valuable to have options. And that's where, like, I think our pitching, going back to like the college side, our starting rotation was so good last year because we had options. We didn't feel confined to just throwing a certain shape and a certain count to a certain type of hitter. Our guys were so good at executing all their pitches. Like our Friday guy, if you said, "Hey Jackson, we got to throw a left on left changeup, in this 2-strike count, we got to execute the shit out of it," he's going to do it, right? He's confident he can do that. And that gives him such a huge advantage because he can throw that pitch, right? And feel like he has another tool in his toolbox instead of like, hey, we got to completely eliminate the changeup, the same sided hitters. It's like, yeah, we know we got to be a little bit careful, but he's confident in his ability to execute that. And we have enough information to know that this pitch is probably going to be successful. So I think that's the big thing. Like the more options you have, you can take pressure off other pitches. You can spread out your pitch usages, right? And you can start to, like I said, you can control platoon splits, and you can feel just as good against right-handed hitters as maybe you do against left, and vice versa. So I think that's what's, it's so valuable to, like I said, to have multitude of shapes. If you can have two fastball variations, 100%. So I think that's where, like I said, the game is trending back towards, the more dynamic the arsenal, the better off you're going to be, and like the higher likelihood of success you're going to have, specifically as a starting pitcher.
Ultimately, it comes to putting hitters in conflict, right? And even if those two fastballs might not grade elite in any form or fashion, the ability to force a hitter to see something different, even if it's just once or twice. I mean, Corbin Burns is a good example. Sinker doesn't grade out as elite or great, but it's effective because it moves a significant amount off of the cutter in an opposite direction. And when you're sitting there thinking you're getting something that's moving away from a right-handed hitter, and then with 2 strikes, it starts off the plate and jolts back, even with below average movement in terms of the metrics, it's effective because you're not expecting it and it's putting you in conflict and you haven't seen it as much. I have a really interesting kind of topic, and obviously we got to respect your time here, that has been fascinating to me. And you mentioned it a lot about the type of hitter. how much does the type of hitter go into not necessarily pitch usage? I think of this more of matchup determined, right? We had a great conversation off air about bullpen usage, and this might be more of an MLB professional baseball conversation, but I've seen a lot more managers go from one right-hander to another right-hander in a situation where for years we've gotten so fixated on the left on left matchup or the right on right matchup and things like that. But I've started to kind of theorize that a lot of that's because of fastball shape and maybe how guys perform against fastball shape in terms of the hitter themselves. So how much do you guys use kind of hitter success against specific pitch shapes, and how that goes into maybe, hey, we're going to go from a righty to a righty, but because he's a ride instead of a sink guy, this guy clobbers sink, and we think this is a matchup that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think for us, it's we're probably not as granular as the big leagues are in terms of that type of decision making. Just with not as large of a sample size on some of these collegiate hitters and metal bats, and like just kind of the differences in the style of the game. But I think for us, we're doing stuff similar, right? Like we're looking at the situation that the game is presenting us and saying, okay, what guy is going to make the most sense in this situation? And for a lot of it, it's really just like understanding what our guys do and the batted ball outcomes that our guys elicit, because I think that's almost how we do it, where we're banking on like the trends that we're seeing with our guys specifically, maybe less on what we're seeing of the opposing hitter, because again, like the data sample size can vary, from program to program that you're facing, and at bats that a guy has. You may have a guy who has a very limited sample size. So I think for us, it's like, okay, if we're in a situation, right, and we're in the late innings and we have a guy, if we're in a part of the game where we got to go to the bullpen and we're trying to elicit a ground ball, like we have a specific guy on our staff who throws a seam shifted wake sinker from an outlier release height. He throws a good sweeper, and a changeup that will get well below the zero line in terms of depth. And he was running, close to a 70% ground ball rate this year. So if we're in a situation where we're looking at the game, right, what's in front of us, what part of the lineup are we in, right? This is a guy that we know can probably get us a ground ball, if we need a double play or whatever it may be. Like that's the guy we're going to go to, right? Like, we're going to try and match up the game the best we can in that regard. So I think it's like we're trying to plug and play based on what, the outcomes we know our guys are producing. And I think that's valuable, right? Is like when you're constructing your bullpen, and you're trying to figure out who's going to play best in what spots, right? Like, if we're at a point in a game where we know like we need some more swing and miss, like we need to have that guy, we need to know who that guy is, right? And we need to be able to call upon that guy, and have him readily available. And it's like if we know a guy is running a super high whiff rate on a slider, and we, say we do have that type of information too on the opposing hitter, like we will do that, right? If we got a large sample size on a guy who's been in a program for 3 years, he struggled for 3 years on hitting sliders, and we have a guy on our team who's running a really high whiff rate on his slider, right? And, then we're going to try and pull that guy out of the bullpen, and play that type of matchup in that part of the game if we have to. But I think it's like, again, at this level, what I've realized, it's really about you need to understand who your guys are, and like you have to have a really comprehensive understanding of how their stuff plays and performs, because like that's how you're going to get the most out of them when you put them in a game. So yeah, it's a little bit of both. I think on this side of the game, you probably have to lean more towards like, looking at the trends of what's occurring, with your guys, because just the sample size can be so volatile in the opposing team. So that's kind of how we do it. It's a combo of both, but I would say if it leans one way or another, it leans more towards, like I said, the trends of what our guys are doing.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think it's a fascinating conversation because I think, from a hitting perspective, I think a lot of it has to do with bat path and success against certain fastball shapes in
Mm-hmm.
terms of bat path and how long you're in the hitting zone and things like that, which again is probably a extremely nuanced conversation that we don't need to get into today at this point in time. But I think it's why you've seen a lot of MLB organizations trend to having, being able to have that, okay, well, if we have a sinker guy, like the Tigers, good example, Jason Foley is in there with a heavy sinker guy, and they turn, and he's a reliable guy who pitched high leverage innings for him, and then they turn to a guy that's more of a four seam guy in situation where like I felt like Foley still had some juice there, like I feel like he could still get some outs. It's like, well, how do you know that this hitter across the way doesn't just have a more uphill swing that dominates sinkers? It's like, well, of course, it's easy to say from the couch versus the information that these managers have. So it's always fascinating to kind of get a perspective on that and how you utilize that information. But John, we really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation. We're grateful that we were able to get out to Tucson and get to interact and see how you guys go about developing talent. We're huge fans of each and every guy on staff there and what you guys are building in Tucson, and definitely really insightful conversation. And we appreciate you taking the time to do it.
Of course. No, thank you guys for coming out again and having me on today. And I'm always down to talk shop on the pitching side. So yeah, no, this was great. I'm glad we could do this.
Definitely. And if anybody's going to be out at the seminar at Wake Forest in December 13th through 15th, they're going to get to hear you and pitching coach Kevin Vance present as well, which I know after having this conversation and after interacting with you guys, a lot of people are going to walk away impressed with what you guys are doing out in Arizona. Not a lot of people get to stay up late to watch West Coast baseball, but I guarantee your guys' names and what you guys are doing is going to be recognizable across the college baseball landscape. And hopefully this conversation is the beginning of accelerating that because you guys are doing an awesome job. It's not easy to pitch in Tucson, and you guys have made it look easy at times. And we're super fired up and we're super big fans here and excited to see what you guys got this spring.
For sure. No, we appreciate it, guys. And like I said, thanks again. And yeah, we're looking forward to that weekend, and we're excited to dive into some more about what we do here for sure.
Definitely, definitely. Well, thank you to our listeners for tuning in, as that will conclude our episode for today. Make sure you're subscribing to the podcast on all podcast platforms, and most importantly, on YouTube. You get to see the video form of this on YouTube. We post episodes really weekly. We're getting back on that train and trying to get some interviews weekly. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at BacksideGB, Instagram at BacksideGroundBalls, and TikTok at BacksideGroundBall. And most importantly, make sure you're sharing with 5 friends. And we'll see you next time on the Backside Ground Balls podcast.